Chapter 6. The carpenter and his wife were convinced that my black hair would attract lightning to their farm. It was true that on hot nights, when the carpenter touched my hair with a flint or a bone comb, bluish-yellow sparks jumped off of my head like devil's lice. In the village, electrical storms came often and abruptly, causing fires and killing people and cattle. The lightning was always described as a great fiery bolt hurled from the heavens. Therefore the villagers made no attempt to put out such fires, believing that no human power could extinguish them, just as a person struck by lightning could not be saved. It was said that when lightning strikes a house, it hurls deep into the earth, where it crouches patiently, growing in power, and every 7 years attracts a new lightning bolt to the same spot. Even objects saved from a burning house that has been struck by lightning were similarly possessed and could attract new lightning. Often at dusk, when the meager flames of candles and kerosene lamps began to flicker in the huts, the skies would become veiled by heavy sagging clouds that sailed obliquely over the thatched roofs. The villagers would grow silent, fearfully looking out from behind the windows, listening to the growing rumble. Old women squatting on cracked tile ovens ceased their prayers and deliberated as to who would be rewarded this time by the Almighty, or who would be punished by obsequious Satan, or on whom fire and destruction, death or crippling malady would fall. The groan of creaking doors, the sight of trees bent by the storm, and the whistle of wind would sound to the villagers like curses of long-dead sinners, tormented by the uncertainty of limbo, or slowly roasting in the never-ending fires of hell. At such moments the carpenter jerkily threw a thick jacket over his shoulders, and while he crossed himself many times, looped an ingenious padlocked chain around my ankle, fastened the other end of the chain to a heavy worn harness. Then, in a roaring gale, amidst flashing thunderbolts, he placed me on a cart, and beating his ox frantically, drove me outside to the village, to a distant field, and left me there. I was far from trees and human habitation, and the carpenter knew that the chain and the harness would prevent me from returning to the hut. I remained alone, afraid, listening to the noise of the receding cart. Lightnings flashed close by, suddenly revealing the outlines of the far-away huts, which then vanished as though they had never existed. For a time a marvelous lull would prevail, and the life of the plants and the animals would be at a standstill. Yet I could hear the moans of the desolate fields, in the tree trunks, and the grunt of the meadows. Around me were forest werewolves would slowly creep forth. Translucent demons would come flying in their beating wings from streaming swamps, and stray graveyard ghouls would collide in the air with a clatter of bones. I felt their dry touch on my skin, and shuddering brushes of the icy breeze of their frozen wings. Terrified, I ceased to think. I threw myself on the earth into the spreading puddles, dragging the rain-soaked harness by its chain. Above me, God himself stretched, suspended in space, timing the horrendous spectacle with his perpetual clock. Between him and me, the murky night deepened. By now the dark could be touched, grasped like a clot of coagulated blood smeared over my face and body. I drank in it, gulped it, smothered in it. It outlined new roads around me and transformed the flat fields into a bottomless chasm. It erected impassable mountains, leveled hills, filled up the rivers and valleys. In its embrace perished village, forest, road shrines, human bodies. Far beyond the boundaries of the known, the devil was sitting and hurling sulphur-yellow lightning, loosening reverberating thunderbolts from behind the clouds. Every bolt of thunder shook the earth to its base and caused the clouds to sink lower and lower, until the wall of the downpour changed everything into a watery swamp. Hours later, at dawn, when the bone-white moon had given way to the bleak sun, the carpenter would drive to the field and take me back to the hut. One stormy afternoon, the carpenter fell ill. His wife fluttered around him, preparing bitter juices, and could not bother to drive me outside the village. When the first thunderbolt resounded, I hid myself in the barn under the hay. Suddenly, the barn was jarred by an uncanny peal of thunder. A short while later, a wall burst into fire, the tall flame growing through the resin-soaked planks. Fanned by the wind, the fire raged loudly. The tips of its long wings extended to the hut and to the cow barn. I darted into the courtyard in complete confusion. In the surrounding huts, people tossed in the darkness. The village was astir. Shouting could be heard from every direction. A dazed, clustering throng, carrying axes and rakes, ran towards the carpenter's burning barn. The dogs howled, and the women with babies in their arms struggled to keep their skirts down, where the wind was lifting up shamelessly over their faces. Every living creature had rushed outside, their tails raised, furious, bellowing cows, jabbed by axe handles and shove blades, were running, while calves on lean, quivering legs tried in vain to cling to the udders of their mothers. Trampling down the fences, breaking off the barn doors, colliding in a stupor with invisible walls of houses, the oxen lunged where their heavy heads hung low. Frenzied hens sputtered in the air. After a moment I ran away. I believed that my hair had attracted the lightning to the barn and the huts, that the mob would surely kill me if they saw me. Fighting with the squalling gale, stumbling over stones, falling into the trenches and waterlogged pits, I reached the forest. By the time I had run as far as the railroad track in the forest, the storm had passed and was superseded by nights full of the loud sounds of splashing raindrops. In a thicket nearby, I found a protected hole. Crouching in it, I listened to the confusions of the mosses and waited there the night through. A train was due to pass here at dawn. The track served mainly to transport timber, one station to another, a dozen miles apart. The cars carrying the logs were pulled by a small, slow locomotive. When the train approached, I ran for a while alongside the end car, jumped a low-slung step, and was carried away to the safe interior of the forest. After some time, I noticed the flat part of the embankment and jumped down, plunging to the thick undergrowth, unnoticed by the guard of the locomotive. The forest was less dense. As I walked through it, I discovered a cobblestone road overgrown with weeds, and evidently long abandoned. At the end stood a deserted military bunker with a massive reinforced concrete wall. There was utter silence. I hid behind a tree and threw a stone at the closed door. It rebounded. The echo came back quickly, and then there was silence again. I walked around the bunker, stepped over broken ammunition crates, scraps of metal, and empty tin cans. I climbed to an upper terrace of the mound, and then the very top, where I found bent cans, and somewhat farther off, a wide opening. When I leaned over the opening, I smelled a foul odor of decay and dampness. From within, I heard some muffled squeaking. I picked up an old helmet and dropped it through the opening. The squeaks multiplied. I began quickly to throw clods of earth into the hole, followed by pieces of metal hoops for the crates and lumps of concrete. The squeaks grew louder. There were animals living and floundering inside. I found a piece of smooth sheet metal and reflected a beam of sunlight into the interior. I saw clearly now, several feet below the opening there surged, billowing and receding, a black churning sea of rats. The surface twitched in an uneven rhythm, glittering with countless eyes. The lights revealed wet black and hairless tails. Time and again, like the spray of the wave, dozens of the long, scrawny rats assaulted with spasmodic leaps their smooth inner wall of the bunker, only to fall back into the spines of others. I gazed at the rippling mass and saw how the rats were murdering and eating each other, pouncing on one another, furiously biting out chunks of flesh and shreds of skin. The spurts of blood enticed more rats to fight. Each rat tried to scramble out of this living mass, competing for a place at the top, for yet each another attempt to climb the wall, for yet another torn piece of rump. I quickly covered the opening with a tin panel and hastened on my journey through the forest. On the way I ate my fill of berries. I hoped to reach a village before dusk. In the late afternoon, as the sun was setting, I saw the first farm buildings. When I approached, some dogs leaped out from behind a fence and rushed at me. I crouched before the fence, waved my hands vigorously, hopping like a frog, howling and throwing stones. The dogs halted, astonished, uncertain who I was and how to act. A human being had suddenly acquired dimensions unknown to them. While they stared at me, dumbfounded, their snouts bent sideways, I jumped over the fence. Their barking and my shrieks brought the owner of the hut. When I saw him, I immediately realized that by an unhappy quirk of fortune I returned to the same village from which I had fled the night before. The peasant's face was familiar, too familiar. I had seen him often at the carpenter's hut. He recognized me at once and shouted something to a farmhand, who rushed in the direction of the carpenter's hut, while another farmhand kept watch over me, restraining the dogs at their leashes. The carpenter came, followed by his wife. The first blow pitched me off the fence directly at his feet. He raised me and held me so I would not fall, and slapped me again and again. Then, holding me like a rabbit by the neck, he dragged me to his farm, toward the charred smell and smoldering ruins of the barn. Once there, he threw me down on a pile of manure. He delivered one more blow to my head, and I fainted. When I came to, the carpenter was standing nearby, prevailing a sizable sack. I remembered that he used to drown sick cats in sacks like this. I flung myself at his feet, but the peasant kicked me away without a word and calmly continued preparing the sack. Suddenly, I remembered that the carpenter had once told his wife about partisans who hid their war trophies and supplies in old bunkers. I crawled towards him again, this time swearing that if he would not drown me, I would show him the pillbox full of old boots, uniforms, and military belts, which I had discovered during my escape. The carpenter was intrigued, though he feigned disbelief. He squatted at my side, grabbing me hard. I repeated my offer, trying dispassionately as I could to assure him of the great value of the objects. At dawn, he harnessed an ox to his cart, tied me by the string to his hand, took along a large axe, and, saying nothing to his wife or neighbors, set off with me. On the way, I racked my brains for a way to tear myself loose. The string was strong. After we arrived, the carpenter halted the cart, and we walked towards the bunker. We climbed to the hot roof. For a while I acted as if I had forgotten the direction of the opening. Finally we reached it. The carpenter avidly pushed aside the tin panel. The stench hit our nostrils, and from the interior the rats squeaked, blinded by the light. The peasant leaned over the opening, but he could not see for the moment because his eyes were not accustomed to the darkness. I slowly moved to the opposite side of the opening, which now separated the carpenter from me, pulling taut the string by which I was tied. I knew that unless I succeeded in escaping in the next few seconds, the peasant would kill me and throw me into the depths. Horror-stricken, I tugged suddenly at the string so hard that it cut my wrist to the bone. My abrupt leap pulled the carpenter forward. He tried to raise, yelled, waved his hand, and dropped into the maw of the pillbox with a dull thud. I pressed my feet against the uneven concrete flange over which the slab had rested. The string grew tauter, scraping against the rough edge of the opening, and then snapped. At that same time I heard from below the scream of the broken, babbling cry of a man. A fine tremor shook the concrete walls of the bunker. I crept terrified towards the opening, directing directing into the interior a beam of daylight reflected from a piece of tin sheet. The massive body of the carpenter was only partially visible. His feet and half of his arms were lost under the surface of the sea of rats, and wave after wave of rats were scrambling over his belly and legs. The man completely disappeared, and the sea of rats churned even more violently. The moving roughs of the rats became stained with brownish-red blood. The animals now fought for access to the body, panting, twitching their tails, and teeth glimmering under their half-opened snouts, their eyes reflecting the daylight as if they were beads of a rosary. I observed this spectacle as if paralyzed, unable to tear myself away from the edge of the opening, lacking sufficient will power to cover it with a tin panel. Suddenly the shifting sea of rats parted, and slowly, unhurriedly, with the stroke of a swimmer, the bony hand with bony spread-eagled figures rose, followed by the man's entire arm. For a moment it stood immobile above the rats scuttling about below, but suddenly the momentum of the surging animals thrust to the surface the entire bluish-white skeleton of the carpenter, partially defleshed and partially covered with shreds of reddish skin and gray clothing. In between the ribs, under the armpits, and in the place where the belly was, gaunt rodents fiercely struggled for the remaining scraps of dangling muscles and intestine. Mad with greed, they tore from one another scraps of clothing, skins, and formless chunks of the trunk. They dived into the center of the man's body, only to jump out through another chewed opening. The corpse sank under renewed thrust. When it next came to the surface of the body writhing sludge, it was completely bare skeleton. Frantically, I grabbed the carpenter's axe and fled. I reached the cart breathlessly. The unsuspecting ox was gazing calmly. I leaped into the box seat and pulled the reins, but the animal did not want to move without its master. Looking behind, convinced that any moment the swarm of rats would rush it out in pursuit, I jabbed the ox with the whip. It turned around in disbelief, hesitated, but the next few blows convinced it would not wait for the carpenter. The cart jerked furiously over the ruts of the long, untraveled road. The wheels tore the bushes and crushed the weeds growing along the trail. I was unfamiliar with the road, and was trying to get as far away as possible from the bunker in the carpenter's village. I drove at a frenzied pace through the forests and clearings, avoiding roads with any fresh traces of peasant vehicles. When night fell, I camouflaged the cart in the bushes and went to sleep in the box seat. The next 2 days I spent traveling, once just missing a military outpost at a sawmill. The ox grew lean and its flanks narrowed, but I rushed on until I was certain I was far enough away. We were approaching a small village. I rode into it calmly and halted to the first hut I came to, where a peasant crossed himself immediately on beholding me. I offered him the cart and ox in return for shelter and food. He scratched his head, consulted his wife and his neighbors, and finally agreed, after looking suspiciously at the ox's teeth and at mine.